Hi there and welcome. Today, to further deconstruct the serial killer narrative against Miss Letby, I would like to share my thoughts on some curious displays of emotion by some of the principals in her imprisonment, the consultants and the jurors. These are displays which, though common knowledge, have flown under the radar of analysis and discussion. They fly under that radar because the media narrative of them at that time was unchallenged and has not been challenged since. That lack of review is because, despite their striking nature, as I think you'll come to see, these displays have been accepted as merely incidental in the greater scheme of the case. The display of emotions in question are two. The BBC reported information that several jurors were in tears as the verdicts were being read out, and the strange spectacle of consultants Dr Brearey and Jayaram in sequence weeping during TV interviews in the days afterwards. I believe that, although for very different motives, the tears of the jurors and the weeping of the consultants are both consequences of, and therefore evidence of, the profound emotional dishonesty which was the driving force of the case against Miss Letby from that day in May 2017 when they first decided to call in the police, through to the day in July of 2023 when the judge gave the jurors their final instructions. I think you'll agree there's a lot more going on with the consultants weeping, so that's where I want to start. I'll speak of the jurors' tears afterwards. So, it's been sometime during the first week after the verdict, as in the final week, the third week of, sometime after the 18th of August last year. I happened to catch an extended interview with Dr Brearey. It may well have been that Panorama program which aired on the 24th, but I can't be sure. Anyway, the interviewer bowls him on the arm with a narrative of heroic failure stroke whistleblowers not listened to in relation to the killings continuing for a year despite the best efforts of the consultants team to alert management that foul play was afoot. We then got a close-up of Brearey's face, and he is silently but very visibly weeping and his voice begins to crack. At that time I was still asleep about the case, but the spectacle still left me vaguely disturbed, though unable to put my finger on why. Later, after waking up to the case, I knew exactly why what I saw put a frown on my face that day. You see, doctors are among the most stable, personable and fundamentally civilized people, but at the same time they are also among the most tough-minded, unemotional people you could ever know. This is because emotion is the enemy of judgment. When emotion undermines the judgment of professionals in other fields, it costs time and/or money. When doctors suffer big lapses in judgment, people die. For that reason, medical training is as much about attenuating the instinctive emotional reactions to things like blood, death and dying as it is about the acquisition of knowledge and technical skills. Every doctor, as an 18-year-old medical student, gets their very own cadaver, and then, really like little trainee serial killers in a way, they spend the rest of their academic training systematically carving it down to the bone and beyond. The end result is that doctors have the same mastery over their emotions around death and dying as like people who work in undertakers or people who work in slaughterhouses. That was the reason Dr Brearey's apparent attack of emotional incontinence caused me cognitive dissonance that day. Some days after the Brearey interview, I took the opportunity to watch Jayaram being interviewed. Unbelievably, when his interviewer started lobbing the same underarm balls to him in the shape of the heroic failure narrative, he also started silently weeping. By that time, I'd seen through the smoke and mirrors of Miss Letby's prosecution and subsequent conviction, and was able to see this weeping for exactly what it was. These men were not shedding tears at some heroic failure to stop the serial killer sooner, or for the babies in a more general sense. Their weeping is more accurately seen as a response, possibly involuntary, to their own psychological needs. They are actually crying for themselves. We can dispense with the whistleblower stroke heroic failure narrative straight off. In the circumstances of that narrative, the psychologically credible emotion they would have been experiencing at the time of those interviews, would have been raw anger, if not outright fury, at the unnecessary harm which resulted from the hospital bosses ignoring their warnings. They would have been out for the blood of those people, not beating themselves up for something obviously beyond their control once they'd made their representations. The reason these two consultants did not experience the only psychologically credible emotion, anger, or indeed even the sorrow they would have the world believe they were feeling at not being better whistleblowers, is that they knew there had been no foul play by Miss Letby or anybody else. The emotion they did experience in discussing those historical events was guilt at their secret scapegoating of Miss Letby. Driven by that guilt, they used those interviews on national television as opportunities to assuage that guilt by shedding psychologically healing tears of contrition and self-pity, but secretively, under the pretense of the tears being ones of regret or sorrow at not managing to stop their serial killer sooner. The scapegoating of Miss Letby was, of course, that through their useful idiot Cheshire Constabulary, these men had instigated a fraudulent prosecution against her in order to avoid taking personal responsibility for the manifest professional shortcomings which had made their unit a failing one. To objectify another person in that way, especially someone you know, is to put oneself in a place of moral and therefore psychological discomfort. In such a place, one's psyche necessarily suffers and therefore yearns for relief from that suffering. That pathetic need for redemption is, I believe, the source of the weeping of the two men. You see, there is redemptive power in public displays of contrition. We are social beings, so some things only become real to the psyche, to the human psyche, if done in public. Acts of contrition are one of them. If, however, the act is performed openly, but in a way sufficiently disguised to avoid the natural consequence of supplication to the group in that way, i.e. being judged, a twisted psyche can then take the benefits of the act of public contrition, essentially, I'm good again now, though not actually having paid the price of redemption because they paid it with the emotional equivalent of counterfeit currency. This is what I believe the weeping comes down to. A disingenuous display of emotion which allowed these compromised, damaged men to pretend to themselves in the snake pits of their own minds that they had wiped the slate clean over their moral aberration against Miss Letby, without actually going through the full process of doing so. Turning now to the jurors' tears, Moritz, the BBC North of England correspondent, with the same gleefully excited, sharing a secret air with which he just revealed the guilty verdict, gave information that several jurors were actually in tears as the verdicts were being read out at the sheer evil of the case. How did she know why these people were crying? As this was literally minutes after the delivery of the verdict, I know she couldn't have asked them, as they hadn't yet been released by the court. Weeks afterwards, it occurred to me, hang on, these people have been sat there for 10 months listening to the case. The novelty of any perceived horror would have long worn off. Also, if horrified by the evil of the case, why would you be shedding tears at the very point, the only point, where you actually got to do something about it by giving the serial killer her just desserts? Like the media narrative around the weeping of the consultants, once you looked at it for a moment, it just didn't scan psychologically. Those jurors were more likely crying because they had not been comfortable with convicting in the first place, or intuitively knew from Miss Letby's anguished sob at hearing guilty that they had made the wrong call and condemned an innocent person. About a week ago, I got to read that New Yorker article from last May for the first time. It turns out from the article, the jury initially spent 13 days in deadlock, making no progress on any of the cases. At that point, the judge called them back in and told them that he would take majority verdicts. They then, at that time, they also lost a member, thus further increasing the odds against Miss Letby. So obviously now you've gone from 12 people needing to be convinced of her guilt to only 10. Anyway, having completed 13 undoubtedly grueling days in the jury room, the remaining 11 jurors then took a further 10 days to get to that verdict that we had on the 18th of August. Mere coincidence that it came out on a Friday afternoon? Anyway, the question also has to be asked, is that procedure of getting to a verdict really very different to the discredited system whereby police and intelligence agencies sweat a detainee down until he or she just signs whatever confession is put in front of them? It seems to me that the jury was first railroaded by the very selective information, false information and innuendo. Then its more cautious and conscientious members were simply browbeaten into submission for that guilty verdict. I'm sure those morally engaged jurors were the ones doing the crying for Miss Letby and her undeserved fate, and maybe crying a little for themselves for the fact of being put in a position where it was impossible to follow through on what they truly believed about the case and see her exonerated. Anyway, that's what I have to say about this. I hope it's been of interest. If you have any, feel free to share your own thoughts in the comments. And once again, thank you for your time.